All right, in this unit we're turning to pragmatism, which is often seen as America's distinctive contribution to the world of philosophy. There's a great deal of truth to this. While the two other philosophies that we've looked at so far, idealism and realism, are both ancient philosophical systems and have had their roots in Europe, clearly, and then over the course of several centuries of philosophizing, there are various versions of idealism and realism that developed. But nonetheless, all of those variations on philosophy up until the 19th century are essentially European-based. As the United States came to be a world power, not only economically, politically, and so forth, but also culturally and intellectually, it made its own distinctive contributions to the world of philosophy, starting in the second half of the 19th century. And the first generation of major pragmatist philosophers, Charles Peirce, William James, and then a little bit later, John Dewey, all of them are American thinkers. But pragmatism is also seen as the distinctively American contribution to world philosophy, in part for the content of the philosophy, which seems to resonate with very strongly American themes. The pragma root, the first half of the word here, is a Greek root, but it's a word that means in the Greek work, right? So what we're emphasizing is workability, right? Doability or functionality. And what's built into pragmatism as a philosophical system is, to put it negatively, a distrust for theoretical abstraction, for ivory tower speculation, right, or for any sort of idle speculation, any sort of sense that philosophy has its head in the clouds and isn't really deeply connected to practical, real-life workability in the natural world. Now, all of that, of course, sounds realist, and at a certain level of abstraction, that same sort of criticism about ivory tower otherworldlyism is a standing realist criticism of the idealist tradition. And I think it then is fair to say that pragmatism is, broadly speaking, in the realist tradition, if you cast your historical net very widely here. Many of the same founders that we find in the realist tradition, particularly in the modern world, Francis Bacon and John Locke, the pragmatists will also cite those among their founders as well. But nonetheless, pragmatism is critical also of realism as a philosophy, and critical on some fairly fundamental issues. So it then, as it develops as a spin-off, right, into its own distinctive philosophical approach. And what the pragmatists will do is argue from their perspective in the 19th century that while they are more sympathetic to the realist way of doing things, nonetheless, the criticisms that they can make of idealism still hold for realism in a much less degree, or much less significant degree, because both the idealists and the realists from the pragmatist perspective share certain fundamental assumptions. Now on the board here I've got three headings here: metaphysics, epistemology, and values. And what I want to do is talk through in this introductory subunit on pragmatism the distinctively pragmatic way about thinking about metaphysics, epistemology, and value issues. And just by way of heading, what the pragmatists will say is that in metaphysics they are the first philosophy in the history of philosophy to take evolution seriously, and the timing is important here. Obviously, the realists and the idealists, as ancient philosophical systems, did not have modern evolution right at their disposal. It is true to say that there were some very early Greek theorists who had some proto-evolutionary type notions, but those were never very systematically developed. Evolutionary theory really is a modern phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon originally of the 19th century. Evolutionary ideas were in the air as the 19th century developed. The intellectual world was starting to think less in terms of timeless absolutes and an unchanging fabric and structure for the universe, and more thinking in terms of process and change, particularly in the biological world. And a lot of this culminates in Charles Darwin's work in 1859 with his publication of On the Origin of Species. Most of the first generation pragmatists, right, are of this generation. They are young men in their teen years or in their early 20s. Charles Peirce, born in 1839, I believe. William James a couple of years later in 1842 or so. Both of them would have been at the prime young point of their intellectual development when Origin of Species bursts onto the scene, but nonetheless they are born into a world and cut their intellectual teeth in a world that is already thinking seriously in evolutionary terms. John Dewey was born in 1859, the exact year that Origin of Species is published, and so then he is born into a world, an intellectual world that is in large part shaped by evolutionary thinking in Darwin's form. So evolution is then what the pragmatists will say that their philosophical system metaphysically is taking seriously, and taking seriously in a way that the realists and the idealists never did, and so on. Epistemologically, the pragmatists imbibe a strong dose of skepticism. There is not as skeptical as one can be. We'll see some of those developments later on in the semester, but nonetheless what they will say is that the idealists and the realists are fundamentally optimistic about the capacity of human beings to acquire knowledge. Of course, the idealists and the realists will disagree amongst themselves about how we acquire this absolute and certain knowledge about the nature of the universe, but nonetheless the assumption that they're both making is that absolute knowledge is possible, or certain knowledge is possible, or that truth, some sort of heavy-duty or epistemological concept, is achievable to us by human beings. Whether in strongly religious forms of idealism, it's because we have direct revelations from God, or if we're able to make a faith commitment and believe in an absolute truth on the basis of faith, or in more secular versions of idealism, if we do have this pure reason capacity to abstract and otherwise intuit our way to higher order truths. Or if we are realists, the realists will be quite optimistic about the power of scientific method, if followed rigorously, to yield definite truths and absolutes about the nature of the natural world. The pragmatists are much more modest, to put it modestly, in their epistemological approach here, and so they will introduce a significant amount of skepticism in their epistemology, and that changes significantly how we think about knowledge. Finally, on value issues, while as I mentioned before, it is fair to say that the pragmatists do come, broadly speaking, I think, out of the realist tradition. They're much more naturalistic in their thinking. While they do have their qualifications, they do think scientific method is the best thing that we have going, and all of those things they then share with realism. Nonetheless, on value issues, they do diverge sharply from realism's individualism. The realists are both individualists in their cognitive orientation, arguing that it's the individual mind, individual observation, important for the individual to process his or her own knowledge and reach his or her own conclusions. The realists also are strongly individualistic in their value approach. It's the individual's liberty, the individual's pursuit of happiness. Individual self-responsibility is a core thesis. It's not to say, of course, that the realists aren't very social, right, as well, but they will argue that social groups ultimately are collections of individuals, and social groupings are put together for the purpose of individuals mutually, right, achieving various ends. With the pragmatists, that emphasis is shifted dramatically in the direction of the social. Not so much in the first generation pragmatists, but certainly by the time we get to the generation of John Dewey, who was the most long-lived and I think the most influential of all of the American pragmatists, and certainly the one who is by far the most influential on American education. What we find in Dewey's pragmatic philosophy is a heavy emphasis on the social values, the communal values, and Dewey's way of putting it is to emphasize, right, the concept of democracy, right, which we will see for him is not simply a more limited political notion of, we vote to decide who has power for a certain amount of time, but democracy becomes a deeper notion for him, that democracy is the way in which we figure out what our core values are as individuals and as communities, and democracy is also going to have some spillover epistemological issues. It's going to be through democratic procedures that we decide what counts as truth, what counts as knowledge, so conceived by pragmatism. All right, let's develop these three themes in greater detail here. First, the themes of evolution. As I mentioned, the pragmatist first-generation thinkers are born into a world that is thinking, particularly in the realms of biology, in terms of process, right, in terms of change. And they come to believe that essentially an evolutionary account biologically is the right way to think about these sorts of things. What we know from biological evolution is that species are not fixed. Species are subject to change. Species live in an environment that is itself subject to dramatic changes. As a consequence, those species that are not able to adapt to environmental changes, those ones die out and go extinct. Those that are able to adapt sufficiently to the new environments will stay in existence, but then over time they themselves will change their features in order to maintain, keep in tune rather with the changing environment. So what we have here is an idea of a biological universe in which rather change, right, is fundamental, in which process, right, is more fundamental. There is, in effect, no fixed species. There are no fixed environments, and also evolution is very open-ended. There's no being that is directing the course of evolution. Evolution is not going in any particular direction, trying to achieve any sort of fixed goals, right, and so forth. Now, let's just speak in terms of biological evolution. What the pragmatists will do is say that evolution, philosophically, is not just a biological a theory that best captures the way the world works. That we should generalize evolution to see all of nature, including all of the universe, as subject to an evolutionary process. The whole world, right, is going through this open-ended process of change, development. Some things come into existence, other things go out of existence. The things that exist at this particular point of time and the conditions to which they are subject may be radically different from the kinds of things that exist at this point in time and the kinds of conditions that they are subject to. So what we then have to do is get rid of the idea that there is in any sense an absolute, right, set of conditions. So there are no absolutes, and there is then no fixity, no stasis, right, anything like that. All right, so we think of the world, everything, right, all the way through physics, chemistry, biology, and ourselves as psychological beings as part and parcel of a deep evolutionary process. Now let's turn to the epistemological issues here. There's a correlate here. Just as human beings come to try to know the world, but the world itself is then changing, the consequence of the skepticism is going to be that what we have to do is remain kind of open-minded. Okay? Just as the universe is open-ended, we ourselves have to be open-minded. Rather than thinking in terms of fixed absolutes that hold timelessly, we have to be a bit more tentative and willing to change, right? Our way of thinking about the universe as the universe, right, continues to evolve here. But what also is built into the skepticism here is an idea that our human cognitive powers, right, as formidable as they might be under some circumstances, are not as formidable as the realists would want to make out. While the pragmatists are sympathetic to scientific method, they will argue that scientific method is the best thing that we have going. Nonetheless, scientific method is a highly fallibilistic process that builds all sorts of biases and errors and so forth into it. We try to bracket those things and weed them out, but that process itself is fallible and is never going to be a perfect kind of process. Now, the skepticism, though, we can say first is directed against the idealists. The idealists believe in the religious forms, in various kinds of mystical sources of knowledge. They believe in revelations. Most pragmatists will have nothing to do with that. They'll make the argument that many of the early belief systems, right, were a product of people who were largely illiterate, didn't know very much about the natural world, certainly didn't have anything that we would call science. And so what they called various kinds of revelations from God really were just kind of static pass-me-down representations of their best take on the way the world is. Faith is no better from this perspective. If you're simply taking faith in somebody else's claim to a mystical revelation, well, you certainly don't have anything to go on. There's all kinds of faiths out there. Most of them contradict each other, so faith is completely unreliable as a method of knowledge, and so we should not engage in that. Now, I don't want to overstate that point about faith. There are some pragmatists, perhaps the most famous of them being William James, who does argue that there is a kind of role for faith, and particularly a religious kind of faith. We'll say a little bit more about that a little bit later, but nonetheless, the general tenor of pragmatism epistemologically is to get rid of altogether those traditionally religious emphases on mysticism, revelation, and faith as legitimate sources of knowledge. So the pragmatists then are much more in keeping and sympathetic to the realist project of saying we're interested in the natural world. How do we come to know the natural world? Well, we use our senses. On the basis of our senses, we start to classify things. We come up with hypotheses. We run experiments. There's lots of trial and error, and then we come up with theories that seem to be good representations or good explanatory accounts of the way the phenomena seem to be going in the real world. And so they will say, yeah, we are fans of scientific method, but if we look at scientific method has two major sources of fallibility. So if we say that the scientific method really is fundamentally based on observation, right, that we start by observing the world, and then on the basis of that we then go on to do various sorts of analytic and logical techniques. All right, just using these broadly to include mathematics and theory construction, right, and so forth. It's a sophisticated interplay of observation and logic. So we might observe something, then form a hypothesis, then we'll logically derive some sort of experiment that would yield a prediction that we could then test. We'll run the experiment. The experiment will yield some observations, and then we will use that observation for and against logically the thing that we derived hypothetically here earlier on. Now, what the pragmatists will do is take more seriously skeptical criticisms about logic and skeptical criticisms of observation than the realists will do. They'll point out, for example, as many philosophers had done before, that observation, for example, is a process that is sometimes subject to various sorts of illusions. Right? We might be standing between a pair of railroad tracks looking as they can go off toward the horizon there, and we know that the railroad tracks really are parallel to each other, but our eyes tell us that they are converging to a point. We might take a stick that we can see when it's in air is a straight stick, but then we'll put it halfway into some water and the stick will appear to bend. We call those things various sorts of illusions. Sometimes the moon seems huge in the sky, other times the moon seems rather small. What's the right size of the eye of the moon as it appears to our eyes? Well, it's hard to tell in those particular cases. We also know that our observations can be subject to various sorts of hallucinations, for example. If we take various sorts of drugs, right, or chemicals, they can alter the way our observational capacities operate. Or we know if we are sick, right, sometimes we will think we're experiencing things in certain sorts of ways when they aren't really that way at all. We also know that the senses are subject to a great deal of relativity, right? The way things look to you, color-wise, might not be the same, the way the same things look to me, right, color-wise. Or even just me, myself, I might know that something that tastes sweet and tasty to me while I'm healthy, if I then get sick and I taste the exact same sort of thing, it won't taste sweet and tasty to me under those kinds of circumstances. Here's my favorite experiment about relativity. It's my favorite because I made it up myself. When I was in graduate school, I had a relatively small apartment, but it was comfortable, but I could run a philosophy experiment one day when I was in the kitchen. I thought of this. I had my sink, and I was doing some dishes in the sink. And immediately to the left of my sink, I had my stove, and then immediately to the right of the sink, I had my refrigerator. So I've got some warm water, initially warm water, a mix of hot and cold in the sink, but then I thought to do the experiment, so I reach over, I turn on the stove, and I put my hand above the stove at a safe distance, but nonetheless where I can feel the heat of the stove. I take my other hand and I put it inside the refrigerator, and I hung out there for about 30 seconds or so. I then take my hand off the stove or away from above the stove, and I plunge it into the water, and that hand says, "Ah, cool water. But then I take the other hand out of the refrigerator, plunge that hand into the same water, and that hand says, ah, warm water. So which is it? We've got the exact same water, but one sensory organ is telling me that it's cool. The other sensory organ is telling me that it's warm. I've got conflicting, contradictory information, and of course the point just is that those sensory organs, my right hand and my left hand, are differently conditioned, right? They are relativized to the conditioning circumstances that they were in, and so there's going to be lots and lots of relativity then that is built into our observation. Now, none of these phenomena are new to anybody. What is new for the pragmatist, or what's important for the pragmatist, is the amount of weight that they want to put on these things. The realists want to say, yeah, all these things exist, but there are different ways of accounting for the phenomenon of illusions, hallucinations, and relativity, and we can bracket those phenomena and so forth. What the pragmatist will insist, though, is that there is no way effectively to bracket the phenomenon of sensory distortions and the fact that our senses are subject to all of these phenomena. They are not necessarily omnipresent, but they are present enough that we can never be sure that in any given circumstance we're not subject to some or all of them, and certainly we cannot be sure, given that science is a very complicated process based on lots and lots of observations, that somewhere in that process there is some sort of suspect observation that we're taking as a not suspect observation and basing various sorts of conclusions, right, and so forth on it. So observation from the pragmatist perspective is a fallible process, in some cases a highly fallible process, and so since science then is based on these observations, science then itself must be fallible. Instead of saying it is, the result here is that what we should be inculcating into ourselves is language that is much more probabilistic, much more tentative. It seems to me that, right? And what we need to do is automate in our thinking and in our speech much more modest observational language, rather than saying it's this color, it's that color, it's this distance away, and all kinds of definite observational claims the way the realists are wont to do. We have to realize that it never actually is, right? Or at least our knowledge of what is at best tentative, probabilistic, fallibilistic, and we might have to say, well, I guess I made a mistake at various points and just take a certain observation away. All right, so what we will then have is, and I'll put this over here, a strong emphasis on the tentative, right? On the probable, right? Or the subject to change, right? And that then becomes a deep, right, way of thinking for us as pragmatists. When we turn to the other side of this scientific method equation, we do lots of observations, but then we do all sorts of sophisticated things with them analytically and logically. The pragmatist will also emphasize that this whole set of processes has its own fallibilities and potentials for error built into them, and we can never be sure that we have bracketed all of those successfully. Now, there's a big complicated story here, but let me just give you a quick and dirty overview of it. Suppose we focus on logic, and we just say within logic there's a fairly standard division between deductive logic and inductive logic. And we'll do a little sidebar. What do we mean by deductive logic? Well, one classical account of deductive logic is to say that deductive logic operates in terms of generalities. So we will have very general, abstract, or universal types of propositions, right, or sentences, and we'll derive other generalities from them, or we'll apply those to particular instances. So I might say all human beings are mortal, Socrates is a human being, therefore. So take the generality, all human beings are mortal, apply it to a particular individual, Socrates. He is a human being, therefore, the conclusion that follows deductively is that he is mortal. And there are lots of different patterns of deductive reasoning. If we just try some abstract patterns here, I might say, for example, that all of the humans, right, are mortal. Socrates is human, so therefore it follows that Socrates is mortal. And that's perfectly fine. I might have as another possible pattern, I might say that all of the A's are B's, all of the B's are C, and then as a logical deductive derivation I can conclude, therefore all of the A's are C. And that's a beautiful thing, perfectly valid argument from a deductive logic perspective. Or I might also try another pattern over here. I might say all, let me just change the letters a little bit here. The L are G, all the D, right, are G. Okay, and then ask what follows from that logically, and put down as a candidate, therefore all of the L are D. All right, so I've got a bunch of abstract patterns up here. This one's fine, give it a check mark. This one's also fine, give it a check mark. But this one, though, as it happens, is bad reasoning. That's invalid reasoning. And like these two here, all humans are mortal, that is true. Socrates is a human, that is true. This conclusion follows necessarily, and if these two are true, this must be true also. Same thing holds here. If all of the A's are B, if that's true, and all of the B's are C, that's true, then given this pattern of reasoning, it follows necessarily that this conclusion that all of the A's are C necessarily is true as well. It's not true in this particular case here, and so if we did some substitutions, we can see that. If I said, for example, all lawyers are graduates of college, say, well, that's true. All doctors are graduates of college, that's also true. It does not follow, though, even though those two are true, that all of the lawyers are doctors, right? That conclusion is false. There might be some lawyers who are doctors, right, and vice versa, but we have two true premises here, and using this pattern of reasoning, we end up with something that is false. That's an indication of bad deductive reasoning. So the point of then doing deductive logic is to sort out all of the possible ways that we can combine premises to try to derive conclusions, figure out which ones are truth-preserving or which ones are examples of valid reasoning, and make sure that we train ourselves to avoid the ones that are not truth-preserving or are invalid, right, forms of reasoning. Okay, and that's a very valuable thing for people to learn methodologically, particularly as the kinds of things that they're trying to figure out as adults becomes more important, and so logic can be a very important part of the educational process. Now, what the pragmatists, though, are interested in is the status of logic, right, as a whole. And while everybody is very impressed with what has been achieved by deductive logic, there is still an important point about the relationship between deductive logic and inductive logic. We can focus on the patterns here, but notice that all of the examples we're using here in deductive argument involve these generalizations. All of the L's are G, all of the H's are M's, all of the A's are B. Where do we get those generalizations from in the first place? Well, of course, I just made them up, right? But in reality, when we're reasoning about reality in the real world, the deductive, or rather the premises that we want to use in deductive reasoning, all of those generalities involve some sort of initial observations that led us to certain kinds of general conclusions, and that is where inductive reasoning comes in. And inductive reasoning, again, on one classical, right, account of inductive reasoning, is to start with particular, right, observations or statements of particular fact, and when we collect a certain number of them, then we are in a position cognitively to make a generalization, right, to a whole group of things. So if we said, for example, all humans are mortal, where did we get that generalizations from? Well, presumably back in the past, right, at some point, right, people were observing humans, human dies, right? This other human dies, this other human dies, seems to happen to all of the humans in that person's acquaintance, and then somebody at some point gets the idea, well, therefore, it must be true of all human beings. And then we learn that partly based on our own experience, but also partly from the reports of everybody else's particular observations over the course of history, and so on. Example, I always think at this point here, not relying on other people's historical say-so. I remember when I started graduate school, it was a place in the world that had a lot of cardinals, which was a relatively new phenomenon for me since I grew up in Canada, and seeing cardinals is a relatively rare phenomenon there. So I found myself fascinated for a couple of months when I saw a whole bunch of cardinals. But outside of my apartment in graduate school, I had a nice big window that looked out the back, and there were some bushes back there. I noticed that there was a male cardinal that came in, so I was observing it, and then another male cardinal came and landed on the same bush, and instantly the first male cardinal attacked it. They got into a bit of a tussle, and one of the cardinals flew off. And then I started to notice over the next week or so that this was a regular phenomenon. Every time there was a male cardinal somewhere, if another male cardinal came within, I believe, anything like 12 feet or 15 feet or so, it would be chased off by the first cardinal that had been there, or it would succeed in driving off the cardinal that was already there. So I saw this maybe a dozen times or so, but before the dozen times had occurred, I'd already kind of come up with a generalization and say, oh, these are male cardinals. All male cardinals are territorial in the spring. And we do that all of the time. That's just very base level scientific reasoning. So I might be saying, right, something like this. This cardinal is territorial. That's a report of my first observation. Then it happens again. So then I say this cardinal, we'll call it C1, is also territorial. And then I see it again. Here's another cardinal. It also, right, is territorial. And that goes on. I collect all of these observations. But then at a certain point, I come to a generalizations that all cardinals are territorial. And I feel quite comfortable in that observation. Not so fast, right? Say the pragmatist and any number of people prior to the pragmatists who have been studying induction as a process of reasoning here. They'll say, if you want to figure out whether this is true or not, we have to pay attention to how much evidence we actually have in support of this particular conclusion here. And what they will say is, look, you might feel quite certain, quite comfortable and so forth about reaching this conclusion on the basis of a few or several observations here, but that speaks more to you rather than the actual logical truth, right, of the situation here. Because consider the scope of this conclusion proposition here. All cardinals are territorial. That's a great, huge, whopping generalization about all of the cardinals that are out there. How many cardinals are there out there? Well, you know, there's dozens and dozens. No, actually there's millions and millions. And it's not just the cardinals that exist now. It's the cardinals that existed 5 years ago, the cardinals that existed a century ago. All of those are covered by this proposition here. All of the cardinals that don't yet exist but will come into existence here. We're talking about a potentially infinite number, right, of particular entities here. But up here in the numerator, we have a very finite number, right, of observations, and on the basis of that, we're generating something that's a potentially infinite number of entities in the class. Now, this is a cheap way of doing this here, but if you actually think of the probabilities of things, how do you calculate the probabilities? Well, you take the number of instances that are possible to you, or in this case, the number of observations that you've actually undergone. That's going to be some low finite number here, and then you divide that into the denominator, but anytime you divide by infinity, I believe, you get pretty much zero, right, probability. By analogy, if you want to figure out what's the probability on a six-sided dice, or die rather, that you're going to get a 3, say, well, you say the die has 6 sides and you're going to roll it once, so you have 1 chance in 6 in this particular case. So the number of possibilities available to you, or given the total number of possibilities here, then you have a 1/6 probability, whatever that works out. In this case here, we're dealing with something that's approaching infinity, so the actual probability is going to then be approaching 0. So the point is, obviously all of this is very controversial and stated very hastily, but the point is from a finite number of observations, and we're always dealing with a finite number of observations. Those who are more skeptical about induction will say we have to be very tentative in reaching great big generalizations over here. So what we should say is not that all C's are T in this case, but probably. And then again, we've got a probabilistic type of qualifier here. If it's only been a couple of observations, then I might even use weaker language. Well, it's a possibility, right? Or it's a tentative hypothesis, right? And so on. And the more observations I have, the more comfortable I'm going to be. But even if I get up to hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of observations, that still is a relatively small number relative to the overall number of things that I'm trying to generalize to. So I have to be tentative in my conclusions, I have to be probabilistic, and I have to recognize that, well, I don't know, maybe I haven't checked all of the cardinals in Asia, if there are cardinals in Asia. I haven't checked the cardinals in Idaho, right, so to speak. I've only checked the cardinals in the Midwest. So I need to get a much more diverse sample and so forth. And until I've done all of that kind of work, and I'm never actually going to get around to doing all of that work, nobody is, my hypotheses have to be subject to change. All right, putting all of that together, what we have from the pragmatist position is a taking very seriously skeptical objections to the power of reason. Now, we're not going to throw reason out entirely. We're not going to throw observation out entirely, right, as pragmatists. We still think that observation and reasoning and science is the best thing going, but we can't be as excited about it, and we can't be, from their perspective, as naive about it as they would claim the realists have been about the power of scientific method. There's an anecdote I want to mention. I think it comes from Bertrand Russell, where during one of his phases he was certainly pragmatic in his philosophical leanings, that I think nicely captures the evolution and skepticism points together. Russell asks us to imagine that we're a chicken, right, born as a little chick. And what we learn fairly quickly is the way the world works is the sun starts to come up each day, then the rooster crows, and then everybody kind of wakes up, and then the little chick will come out of the hen house toward the little area where the chickens hang out for the day. The farmer will come along and will throw down some feed, and then the chickens will go out and start to peck away at the food that the farmer has thrown down for it. And this happens for the first several months of the chicken's life, and as the chick is growing up and becoming a chicken itself, and it happens for the first year, right, of the chicken's life. And so we start then to say, on the basis of observation and noticing the patterns here, that there's a certain regularity built into the structure of the universe, and the chicken knows this, the regularity that's built into the structure of the universe through observation and experience here. But then what happens one day is the sun starts to come up, the rooster crows, the chicken wakes up, pokes its head out of the hen house. The farmer comes by, grabs it by the scruff of the neck, takes it over to the chopping block, and whack. The chicken then is going to be supper right that night. Now, what's the point here? Well, the point is, in part, evolution, right? The universe is subject to change. From the perspective of the chicken, the stability and the order and the regularity, that was only very localized and so forth. There was a sort of larger framework, right, according to which the world was operating that the chicken was oblivious of, and the rules of the game changed, particularly for that chicken on that particular day. So the rules of the game were fairly regularly changing, and also the chicken, from its particular perspective, had very limited perspective, right? It was only aware of what was going on in that particular barnyard at that particular time for a certain amount of time. It did not have cognitive access, right, to that bigger picture, and so what it had was very tentative knowledge, or what it should have held to be very tentative knowledge, very partial knowledge, and it should have had the epistemological modesty. It should not ever have said, I know what is going to happen tomorrow. Instead, it should have had something much more tentative here. Now, to put these 2 points together, I wanted to formulate a criticism that the pragmatists then will make of both of the idealists and the realists, to differentiate themselves from both of those schools of thought. The depth of the taking seriously evolution, and the depth of taking seriously the skepticism here. And also, and again, partly explaining the name, pragmatism, why that was chosen, and why it's a very good choice of name for this approach philosophically. What the pragmatists will say is that both the idealists and the realists will, when they're thinking about the human condition, particularly the human condition philosophically, they will say and believe that we are primarily knowers. All right, I'll emphasize that. And secondarily, actors. And now what we mean by that in this context here is to say that for idealism and realism, the major project philosophically, and the major project then in life, is to come to acquire knowledge. Good knowledge, solid knowledge, true knowledge, perhaps even ultimately true knowledge, right? Knowledge that you can take to the bank for forever. And so that then is to say that our project is to try to come to know the mind of God in religious forms, or try to come to know the forms, or in more realist form, to try to know the scientific truth about the world. The idea then being that if we can get that project sorted out, we can get knowledge of the way the world actually works, then and only then do we take that knowledge and we formulate a plan of action. We put that knowledge into practice and we act in the real world. What happens, though, for pragmatism is that they say, given the skepticism, that we are never going to achieve anything that approaches, right? Knowledge, ultimate knowledge, certain knowledge, timeless knowledge, absolute knowledge, and so forth. The fact is that we start from a position of ignorance, and in much of our lives we remain in ignorance. We might have relatively workable theories that are doing pretty good, given our relatively limited framework and perspective on the universe. But rather than getting hung up on this quest for timeless knowledge, for certain truth, and so forth, what the pragmatists will say, what it is to be a human being, what our primary project is to act in the world and to act successfully, right, in the world. That first and foremost, we start from a position of ignorance, and we don't just sit around waiting for revelations to occur before we act. Instead, we act in ignorance. We try stuff, and it's a matter of trial and error. We do this, and then we'll get some feedback, and then we'll try something else. We get some feedback, and it's an ongoing process of first acting, right, in the world, and then secondarily sorting through and evaluating the results here. Instead, what we will argue here as pragmatists, they will say and believe that we are primarily, right, actors, right, or agents, right, or doers, right, or anything in that particular set of synonyms in this category here. So we're interested in functioning, we're interested in performance, we're interested in doing, right, first and foremost, and hence the name pragmatism with its emphasis on, right, working, functionality, doing, right, and so forth. That's a perfectly good, rather, label for this approach philosophically. All right, we've talked a lot about pragmatic philosophical theory. To make things a little bit more concrete, I want to tell you a story I'm pretty proud of. So I think it nicely captures a lot of the pragmatic themes in allegorical form, and so we can sort through the truth or not of these kinds of claims here. What I want to imagine, or ask you to imagine, is that one night you go to sleep. And then unbeknownst to you, while you are sleeping, a team of guys that I have hired breaks into your home very silently, and they chloroform you while you are sleeping. And then they take you out to the airport and put you on a plane that I have chartered, and they fly you out to the middle of some ocean somewhere. What they then do is they put you in a submarine. They then leave the submarine. The submarine has already been set up the way I wanted it to be set up. Seal the doors so that it can only be opened from the outside, and then they fly back home, a job well done, and they collect their checks. Now you wake up after a certain amount of time to find yourself in unfamiliar surroundings, and naturally you're wondering what's going on. So you look around, obviously you are subject to a certain amount of anxiety. It seems like you are in a submarine, and indeed you are in a submarine. But then when you're looking around, you see that there's a note that's been left for you. And because I'm a kind person, I've left some instructions for you and some information for you to go on. So you open the note and you read the note, and it has information like the following. You are on a submarine in the middle of some ocean somewhere. Actually, it might not be the middle of some ocean. You're just out in the ocean somewhere, very far from land. The air circulation system works just fine. You have plenty of air reservoirs. There's also plenty of food in tins and other forms, so that you will not run out of food for many months should that be necessary. You also have plenty of water, so you won't run out of that. Don't worry about that. Also, the boats, the submarines rather, motors are working just fine. The navigation system is also working just fine, so you have a compass, the steering and so forth are accurate. However, I do tell you, you do have a periscope, but the periscope is slightly cracked and slightly fogged, so it's kind of sort of working, but not working very well. And also the sonar, I had installed a very ancient sonar system, and so you do get some useful signals there, but you're also getting a lot of static when you're trying to listen to the sonar system. All right, I've also left you a notebook and some pens and pencils so you can keep records or write a diary, whatever you feel like at this particular point. Okay, end of my letter to you. Question, what happens next, right, in this story? Well, as you take stock of your situation, one thing that is not going to happen is that you're going to get knowledge, right? It's not the case that God is going to visit you and reveal to you some truths about where you are and what you need to do in order to get back to wherever it is that you want to go. You don't have anybody else on the submarine with you whom you can rely on to have knowledge of how to work a submarine or of any sort of navigational issues. You are on your own, and you are in a state of ignorance here. Also, I've not left you any maps, so you can't rely on pre-existing scientific cartography and the wisdom and experience as collected in maps of other people. Instead, you are, again, on your own in a relative state of ignorance. Now, you do have two sources of information about the outside world. You do have the periscope, rather, and you do have the sonar as well. But again, in those cases, those are partly disabled or they're only partly functional, and so the quality of the information that you're getting from them is unreliable. Okay, so part of this allegory, or the story that I'm telling you here, is constructed to focus us on some pragmatic epistemological themes, right, about knowledge. We've eliminated revelation, we've eliminated just having faith in some sort of a tradition, or just trusting some other people. All you've got to go on is some unreliable or only partially reliable sensory observations, and you have no pre-existing knowledge about how to deal with submarines in the middle of the ocean. All right, so I'm trying to model then the pragmatic epistemological predicament. So what do you do next, right? Well, what the pragmatist is going to say, and I think what you would say fairly quickly, is it's pointless in this circumstance to try to seek more knowledge, to seek more information, to seek any sort of reliable or authoritative knowledge about the situation, my surroundings, right, and so forth. The knowledge just is not forthcoming. You are going to remain in a position of ignorance. So the only thing that can happen next is for you to try something, right? That is to do something, to see what works, and then see if it in fact does work, and then on the basis of that maybe try something different and so on. And that's the point. Starting from ignorance, not starting from a position of knowledge, we're first then going to have to act in this situation. So you go over to the controls, you figure out how to turn the submarine on, you figure out how to work the steering controls. You set the thing for, say, 2 knots. You, if you're clever, will notice your compass heading. You'll make a note of it. I'm facing northeast right at this point here. I also have a clock mounted there. Here is the time. I set the thing at 2 knots, and then off I go. So I try something. I do something. I have no clue whether it's going to work or not. But your submarine starts moving along in a northeasterly direction at 2 nautical miles per hour for a certain amount of time. Okay. Then you bang into something and your submarine comes to a stop. So you power down a little bit and you take stock of your situation. What did you bang into? Well, you don't know. There's no way to look. You look through the periscope. You don't get anything because it's relatively dark outside. And the sonar isn't really picking up anything distinctive. So you just banged into something. You might try to bang a little bit further forward, but you're stuck if you try to go in that direction. So what happens next? Well, again, knowledge is not forthcoming, so you just, in a trial and error way, have to more or less randomly, I'll pick a different direction, right, in this particular case. I will now, instead of going northeast, I'll turn so I'm facing in a more easterly direction, make note of the time, I'll maybe set it at 3 nautical miles right at this point here, and off I go. And suppose, make a long story short, you find yourself bopping around in the ocean for a while. Every once in a while you go up to the surface, you see if there's anything to see. You can sometimes see hazy blue. Sometimes you see what might be a cloud. Sometimes you see what might be a ship right off in the distance, but you're not able to hail it. And then, long story short, go up to the surface, and you're pretty sure that what you see now is the Statue of Liberty. It certainly looks a lot like it, and it turns out you are in fact in New York Harbor, and of course all of the New York Harbor authorities are converging on this submarine that suddenly appeared in the harbor. You're released from the submarine, you tell your story, and then eventually you end up home and safe and sound in your own bed, right, once again. That's round one. Unbeknownst to you, one night again you're sleeping, I send the guys in, they kidnap you after having chloroformed you, send you off, or take you off rather, to the submarine out in the middle of the ocean somewhere, and seal you up again, and then you wake up after a certain amount of time, and there you are again, exact same submarine. And again, there's a note waiting for you on the table, and when you read the note from me, what it says, exact same situation as last time. The only difference is that this time you have your notes from the last trip that you made. Okay. All right, so you're now in a better situation cognitively, but let me ask, what do you know in this circumstance? Would you say that you know how to get to New York Harbor? And you would kind of say, well, I can probably get through this again, and I can probably find my way back to New York Harbor. And what I do have to go on are the notes that I made from last time. But what's the status cognitively of the notes that you made from your previous trip? They're certainly very far from certainty, they're very far from revelation, they're certainly far from authoritative. You're probably not absolutely certain that your record keeping was perfectly accurate. There might have been some mistakes. You're not exactly sure that you were always going at 3 knots when you were going along. And so forth. And you're also not sure, because there was a whole lot of trial and error in your first trip, that that's the most efficient way to get back to New York Harbor. There might be various kinds of shortcuts that if you analyze your notes, you can find that you were doubling back at various points and you didn't really need to do that. So you're in a better situation cognitively, but still you're very far from knowing, right, in any very strong sense, how to get back to New York Harbor. Also, this is only to speak of your cognitive side of the equation here, so to speak. What also is important is to realize that you are in the ocean, and the ocean is a very fluid type of environment, which is in part why we are in a submarine in the ocean, according to this allegory here. We know that, for example, that thing that you banged into the first time when you were on the trip, what was that thing that you banged into? Is it still there? Well, it might be a whale, or might rather have been a whale, and you banged into it and stunned it, but the whale is no longer there. So it might be the case that you could sail right through that particular place again. It might be that it was a rock formation that you banged into, and that the rock formation is still there. On the other hand, it could have been that there was an undersea earthquake, and that rock formation is no longer there, and it's clear sailing again. On the other hand, there might have been earthquakes undersea at various other places when you were bopping around on the first place in the intervening time, and now there are rocks and various other things that you might bang into that you didn't bang into the first time through. You also know, have some knowledge rather, of ocean currents, that those are highly variable, and so when you thought you were going in a northeasterly direction in a fairly straight line, it might have been that you were drifting as a result of ocean currents or temperature inversions or all sorts of things that could have happened in this constantly changing, constantly evolving environment that is the ocean. So again, partly because of the partialness of your knowledge, and partly because of the highly changeable nature of the environment that you are operating in, any claims that you might be making to yourself or considering that you know how to get back to New York Harbor would have to be at best very tentative, very probabilistic, right, and so forth. Nonetheless, you give it a shot, right? Again, we do the trial and error thing, and in some cases you figure out some efficiencies, and instead of bopping around in the ocean, say, for a month before you find your way back to New York Harbor, there you are, you're back in New York Harbor after 2 weeks. The harbor authorities release you from the submarine, and home you go again. All right, happy ending to that story. Until, yes, round 3, you wake up one morning, and there you are, you're back in the submarine again. Same drill, except in this case here, I've also kidnapped one of your friends, and your friend is in the submarine with you. And I've left you a note to both of you saying exact same situation as the first 2 times, food, water, mechanicals, and so on. You also have your records from your previous 2 trips. The only difference is your buddy's along for some social company in this particular case. All right, now your friend is no doubt quite anxious right at this point here, and then you will find yourself just saying, no problem, I know how to get us back to New York Harbor. Again, with all the appropriate qualifications about your knowledge about how to get back to New York Harbor. But what if your friend surprises you at this point after having calmed down and says, well, while we're here, I don't really want to go to New York Harbor. I've got some vacation time, and nobody's really going to be worried about me as I take off at various points anyway. While we're here, why don't we go to Rio? Why don't we go to Cape Town? Why don't we go to Sydney? Let's go to some other exotic part of the world that we've never been to before. Now, here's the question. What's the status of your knowledge about how to get back to New York Harbor? If your friend says, no, let's go to Cape Town, South Africa, that would be a great trip. Well, it's completely useless, right? Your knowledge is no longer functional, it's no longer helpful, it's no longer workable given the new value framework that your friend is bringing to the particular situation here. All right, you've now heard Plato's allegory of the cave, and you've heard Stephen's allegory of the submarine. Which is a better allegory? Right? Plato's a big shot in the history of philosophy. I've got a little competition going on with Plato, so you be the judge. Who has the best allegory? All right, and that then brings us to the third way in which the pragmatists are different from both the idealists and the realists. And to make this point, I want to go now to the board. All right, I want to formalize a little bit about pragmatism in a logical sequence here, taking the philosophical themes that we've introduced earlier and the allegory of the submarine, right, as I like to think of it, having shown kind of 3 important things about the pragmatic approach to knowledge, the pragmatic approach to truth, or anything in that particular era. What the pragmatists will emphasize is that knowledge or truth, if we can use the word truth with appropriate qualifications here, but what we call truth is always partial, and that's an epistemological point that comes out of the degree of skepticism here, that what we call truth is always subject to change, and that is something that comes out metaphysically given the nature of an evolving universe, but also that what we call truth is, from the pragmatic perspective, something functional. That is to say, truth is not abstract, ivory tower, interesting for its own sake. Rather, truth is that which works, right? That which enables us to achieve our goals in the real world that we happen to find ourselves in. And so a big part of the notion of pragmatism is not simply a value orientation toward practicality and away from theory, but an epistemological notion that what we call truth, right, is defined in terms of workability, the satisfaction, the achievement of goals, of our desires in the real world, right, so to speak. So that said, I want to develop a logical derivation here that tries to tidy up everything that we have said so far. Suppose we then say, pragmatic perspective truth, right, if we use that word, is, right, what works. Okay. Emphasizing the workability, right, of truth. Well, the next logical question then is to say, well, what is it that works? What's our criterion, or what are our criteria for what works here? And then here we have some sort of a value component that has to be built into this here. We'd say that something like, what works is what achieves our goals, and our goals are defined in terms of various desires that we want to have satisfied. So we can say that what works is what satisfies, right, our desires. So to go back to the submarine example, if your goal is to get to New York Harbor from whatever it is, then that little theory that's captured in all of the notes that you have taken, that works to get you back to New York Harbor. The notes that you've made are true, and so we can consider them, right, as a functional truth in that particular case. Put my S in here. Now, let's then do the logic. If truth is what works, and what works is what satisfies desires, then it follows that, therefore, truth is what satisfies desires. And if it's not obvious at this point, or hasn't been up to this point, at this point, clearly we're starting to play with philosophical fire. And at this point, the idealists and the realists are both starting to have conniption fits and ready to object seriously. But let's carry on before we consider some of those objections. If truth is what satisfies desires, then we can ask, well, what is the nature of desires and the satisfaction of them? Well, we would then say something like the following. Desires are clearly they're not out there, intrinsic, or they're not out there in the objective world. Rather, desires are subjective. Right? They are things that are in us, right? Or they're part of the subjective reality, right, that we have. And as a result of that, again, if we do the math, truth is what satisfies desires, and desires are subjective. It then follows that truth is subjective. We can also make another side implication here. We can say, actually I'll just put it down here, we don't need to put it off to the side. We can argue that subjects are variable, right? Changeable. Right. What I desire now is not necessarily what I desired 10 years ago in my life. What I desire as core values in my life might be very different from what you desire, right, as core values in your life. So there are lots of dimensions of variability here. And as a consequence of that, if we again do the math, truth is subjective and subjects are variable, it then follows that truth is variable. And this certainly is a pragmatist theme, right? If we couch it very generally here, if the universe is subject to variation right across time, then it would expect to say the truth evolves right across time. If what we can take to be truth is a basis of our partial and limited take on things, but further information comes to light, then what we take as true is also then going to be subject to change right across time here. So what we have up here is a notion of subjectivism. I'll put that in brackets here as an important philosophical theme for pragmatism. And then down here, this notion of variability, I will assign the label relativism. And on both of these themes, the relativism and the subjectivism, the pragmatists rather are in very different philosophical territory than both the idealists and the realists. For both the idealists and the realists, truth is ultimately objective. There is some external object that is the grounding for or ultimate source of what gets taken to be true. Right? If we are idealists, we're going to believe it is God who is the standard of truth, and God is independent of us. Or it's the Platonic forms that are the standard of truth, and the forms are independent of us. And so then what is true does not at all depend on what we as individual subjects believe or want to believe. If we are naturalistic realists, we are going to argue that what is true, the standard of truth, is some sort of fit with or correspondence to an external natural reality, the world of facts as it actually is. And again, the facts are going to be the facts independently of what we subjects want to believe. So in getting to a subjectivist conclusion here, the pragmatists are clearly in a very different philosophical universe. On this point of relativism as well, both the idealists and the realists will say at a certain level of a certain level of abstraction, the important truths are universal, right, for all human beings, right? If we are religious idealists, we're going to say there's one God, and God speaks to all human beings, and so there's one set of truths that ultimately apply to all human beings. If we're Platonic idealists, we'll argue there's one set of forms up in the formal world, and that formal world applies to everything particular down in this particular universe. So there's ultimately again one one set of truths that apply. If we're naturalistic realists, we're going to argue that relative truth does not apply to most scientific laws, most scientific principles, all of mathematics and so forth. All of those things as descriptions or capturings of the way the world works. Well, there's one world out there, there's one causal order, however complex it is, and so ultimately there is one a universally correct way of capturing the way the world works, and truth is not relative to you or to me or changeable right across time in that particular respect. Now, certainly playing with philosophical fire here, but what the pragmatist will do is buttress this derivation here with a certain number of social claims. And this is where we'll make a stronger connection to the value theory that is built into pragmatism. What the pragmatist will say is that if we come to believe that truth is subject, that truth is variable, if we believe deeply that we're an evolving universe and that our knowledge is partial, and so we have all of the appropriate epistemological and cognitive modesty that is appropriate here, we're going to put ourselves in a position to solve certain kinds of social problems much more efficiently, much more workably than the traditional philosophical alternatives allow us to do. For example, if it is the case that we realize that what we call truth is a little bit more subjective and it's more relative to me, then in my claims I am going to be a whole lot more modest, right, in my approach here. Instead, what I am not going to be is I'm not going to ever feel that I have got certainty. And what this is then going to mean is I'm never going to be dogmatic. I'm never going to say, I know what the truth is, and if what you believe is the truth differs from what I believe, then clearly you're wrong, and that sets us up for certain signs of social relationships here. Instead, I will be much more tentative in the kinds of claims that I will be making. And so I'll have epistemological modesty, epistemological tentativeness, as opposed to the claims of certainty and the claims of dogmatic truth that come out of. Certainly the idealist tradition has a less good track record on this respect, and to some extent also out of the realist tradition. Now, the social benefits that the pragmatists say are going to come out of this is that if people are modest and tentative in their claims, nobody believes that he or she has a lock on God's truth or the one right true theory of everything. People are less inclined to think they will be in a position to impose their truth on other people, or use any sort of methods, either psychological pressure or even physical coercion, to get other people to conform to what they take to be the absolute truth. Instead, what we will be is a whole lot more tolerant, because we'll recognize that our beliefs are partial, they're tentative, other people have different data sets, different interpretations, and all of that is fine. And so what comes along with that is a willingness to live and let live, right, when there are different interpretations and different data sets operative here. As opposed to what is more likely to come out of a tradition that believes that there are truths, that their tradition has a lock on those truths are important socially, any sort of a view that it says I can use imposition on other people to make them believe and conform to what I take to be the absolute truth in this particular case. And so this then is going to be a philosophy from the perspective of the pragmatists that allows for a much more peaceful, live and let live, harmonious kind of social organism. I'm going to work through a couple more examples here, talking about the social benefits of from a pragmatic perspective, of a more subjectivized and relativized approach to knowledge and philosophy. I want to work through religion. We've mentioned just a minute ago that from the pragmatic perspective, one of the major problems we have had, not only intellectually but also socially, have been philosophical systems that believe in higher truth, that believe in absolute truth, believe in certainty. This has then led to a widespread philosophical justification for various sorts of dogmatism, impositions and intolerance. And so the pragmatic argument is that a certain amount of epistemological modesty can diffuse a lot of that and lead us to have a more tolerant and open kind of society. Now, religion is an example that is on the pragmatist's mind here. And here I do want to introduce a qualification about the pragmatic view of religion. Pragmatists tend to be negative on much of the history of religion, given that religion's core philosophical claims about an absolute being who delivers absolutely certain truths and top-down imposition, all of that runs against the grain of pragmatism. But nonetheless, there is a way in which one can be pragmatically religious, and particularly in the 20th and 21st century American and Western European, more broadly Western civilization approach to religious matters that should sound very modern, very comfortable, very unproblematic. And the pragmatists will say that their philosophy is actually the one that best captures religion in the modern world. So for example, though, let me start with a non-religious example. Let me use the example of Christmas time and Santa Claus. Right? Do you believe in Santa Claus? Well, probably not right at this point in your intellectual development. But go back to the point at which one is in second grade, right? Or imagine that you are the parent, right, of a second grader, and it is now November, shading on into December, and your second grader comes home from school and starts asking various kinds of questions about Christmas and Santa Claus. And this is because, of course, your second grader has been talking to those evil fourth graders who are planting all sorts of doubts in his or her mind about Santa Claus. And so your kid starts asking very reasonable questions like, is there really a Santa Claus? And how does Santa Claus get into our house? Because, you know, Santa is a big guy and our chimney is only this big and so forth. Can reindeer really fly? And that's a whole lot of houses all over the world. How does he really know who's naughty and who's nice? That seems a bit so much. All right, so the kid's asking all the kinds of questions that kids who are starting to doubt something that they didn't have questions about when they were younger. So they're starting to grow a little bit cognitively right at this point. What is the standard reaction? Right, pragmatists will ask and point out of most parents the first time these kinds of questions start to be raised by their second grader about the existence of Santa. They'll point out that most parents lie. They lie as creatively and as cleverly as they possibly can, right? They come up with all kinds of just so explanations. They invoke magic. They invoke this, that, and the other thing, and then they, of course, use the heavy artillery if the kid doesn't seem to be going for it, and say Santa only brings presents to kids who really believe in him. And of course, the kid is wise enough at this point to see what the game is, and so is in a position to will himself or will herself into believing in Santa Claus for another year. Okay, fairly common phenomenon, but what's the philosophical point, right, of this example as laid out here? The pragmatists will say that what we are primarily concerned with, right, when we're talking about Christmas and Santa and our children, is not objective truth, right? That's not the overarching consideration in the situation. Instead, we're concerned with our desire to have a certain kind of holiday experience, right, for ourselves and for our children, right? That we want to have our kids believe in Santa Claus as this benevolent, gift-giving individual, because that enriches the experience for them and it makes it more exciting for us because we get to play these sorts of games and we get to see, right, how excited and so forth our kids are about Santa. So in our heart of hearts, right, where there's a conflict then between objective truth and subjective desire, we typically function in a much more subjectivistic fashion. Right? Now, how far do we want to push the Santa example? There are no great world-shaking truths or consequences that are online in this case here, but if we take Santa Claus and the dynamic that's working there as a smaller scale childlike example and blow it up to an adult level concern, what happens when we get into our teen years, for example, and we're starting to be more cognitively alert and we start talking to other people who start planting doubts in our mind about whether God really exists, right? And there are all kinds of reasonable questions and objections that can be planted in our minds about God. what goes on in the vast majority of people's minds when they confront this issue of whether God really exists or not. What the pragmatists will say is, for the vast majority of people, what actually happens is a subjective commitment, right? It's a desire that drives the decision making in this case. People put to themselves, is it such that I want to live a life such that God and religion is a part of my life, and if I feel a deeply felt need to have God as part of my life, then that is the kind of commitment that I am going to make. If, on the other hand, we do know there are some people who fall into this category, when they confront that set of issues, they don't feel a deep need to have religion or God in their lives, and so they then make a different kind of commitment. They come to believe different truths. They have different world views, and that's perfectly fine. And we're comfortable with that in the 20th century. We're comfortable with that in the 21st century. You have your truth, I will have my truth, and we'll have a live and let live tolerant kind of approach to religion. And it's a good thing, right, that we have this live and let live approach to religion in the 21st century because we know the history of religion when the vast majority of people on religious matters believe that there is such a thing as objective truth, and they believe that there is such a thing as higher eternal truths, and that it's important for the salvation of my soul that you believe exactly what I believe and that you act the way that I want you to believe, and you're doing the same sort of thing to me as well. Now, what the pragmatists will also point out is that necessarily, when it comes to matters of religion, we have to decide on subjectivist grounds because there is no objective evidence forthcoming one way or the other. And as evidence of that, the pragmatists will say, as William James did, we've been arguing about these issues for 2,500 years, for 3,000 years, for as long as there have been human beings who have had any sort of religious beliefs as well. And it's the exact same arguments generation after generation that get kicked around back and forth. There is no proof of the existence of God. There's not at this point likely to be any proof that is forthcoming, but equally so, there's no knockdown proof against the existence of God. So again, we're in a position of epistemological agnosticism, or we're in a position of having partial knowledge. There isn't going to be objective knowledge forthcoming one way or the other. And if objectivity can't pronounce on this important matter of religion, then we're falling back to a state of subjectivity, and it's then necessarily going to be a subjective desire that's going to lead to a commitment one way or the other. All right, so that then folds in all of the major pragmatic themes, right? Knowledge is going to be subjective, right? Truth is going to be subjective. What works is going to be the decisive criterion here, but what works for some people is not necessarily what's going to work for other people. So we have the relativity, and then also if we have the relativity and the subjectivity and we're comfortable with that, then socially, right, we can work out a tolerant and live and let live atmosphere with respect to religion, and that's just fine. All right, so we've talked through the pragmatic themes of truth as tentative, truth as that which is workable, truth as necessarily subjective, and truth as necessarily relative, and then the corresponding social benefits of having a more tolerant, open-ended live and let live, and hopefully less judgmental approach to a social organization. But there's a problem here, and it's a deep philosophical problem here, and it's one that the idealists and realists are always very quick, and reasonably so, to level against this whole pragmatic approach here. So I want to indicate here the problem in a completely tolerant and non-judgmental way. It's the problem of all of the weirdos and sickos who exist in our society. The problem is this: if we say, for example, that truth is what works and truth is what satisfies desires, what do we say about all of the people whom ordinarily we would designate as weirdos or very sick individuals or outright evil individuals who have all kinds of desires that they want to satisfy and have figured out various ways of working in the world to get those desires satisfied? So what do we say? The objection runs about people who say, well, I'm really sadistic and I'd like to axe murder lots of people, and so I've got a really sharp axe and that seems to work really well. What do we say in a tolerant, non-judgmental live and let, in this case, die for some people, approach a wishy-washy direction that pragmatism, we might say, seems to be taking us down. What do we say about people who are child molesters and various sorts of sexual weirdos, right, and so forth? And those certainly are extreme cases, but there's lots of things that we can think of that would fit into the category, whatever we are able to call weirdos and sickos. If we follow this, then it doesn't seem like we have any sort of serious moral objections to any of those things. Truth is what works for those guys. What works is what satisfies their desires. Truth is what satisfies their desires. Their desires are subjective, but we have different subjective desires. Truth is subjective, so subjects are variable. So truth is variable. So what's true for those people is just different than what is true for me or what's true for you. But I'm epistemologically modest. I don't want to impose my value framework on you. I have to therefore be tolerant of whatever your different value framework is, right, and so forth. Now this is a problem because a big part of morality seems to militate, right, against the idea that in any way, right, people who are child molesters or axe murderers, right, and so forth, should get a toehold right in the door. Those things are absolutely wrong. Whenever they happen, under any circumstance, there is no excuse. We should be absolutely judgmental and intolerant, right, of people who fall into those kinds of categories. But the problem then is that pragmatism, as derived here, seems to undercut, right, our ability to do so. Now, this is an objection, of course, that pragmatists will take seriously, in part because they recognize it themselves, but also it's one that they have to take seriously because all of their philosophical opponents beat them over the head with it every single time. And it was a problem for pragmatists, particularly in the first generation or so of pragmatism, because built into the first generation or so of pragmatism was a certain assumption that the second generation of pragmatists wanted to change in order, in part, to solve this particular problem of judging people as weirdos and so forth. And it takes us to the issue of social approaches to morality versus individual approaches to reality. And this is a way, again, in which the pragmatists differ significantly from the realists, who are much more individual, right, in their approach, not only to cognition issues, but also to value issues as well. The assumption that the second generation of pragmatists will point out that we have been making when we're doing this derivation is probably that we are assuming an individualist approach here. So we've been assuming that truth is what works for the individual, that what works is what satisfies individual desires. Do you want to go to New York? Do you want to go to Cape Town? Do you want to go to Sydney or wherever? And so forth, right? And so desires are subjective across the individual. So we have individual subjective truth, and truth is variable and relative to the individual. And then that sets us up for the problem of all of the individual weirdos and individual sick people or evil people who are doing all of those horrible sorts of things. What the pragmatists will say is, well, there is no such thing as absolute truth, right? We've dispensed with that. There is no such thing as certainty. We're never going to be in an epistemological position to pronounce morally any sort of absolute condemnation and intolerant judgment on anybody. But we don't have to be if we change the assumption that the operative unit, morally speaking, or the significant value, right, grouping is the individual, to an assumption that that is a social unit. So what we can do is say is that really when we're talking about values and goals and what works, is not the values of the individual or what works for the individual that we're primarily concerned with. What we're primarily concerned with is what works for the group, right? What works for the social unit, however we define the social unit. That is going to be our standard of evaluation. And so everything then changes. So what we're then going to say is that truth is what works, right, for society. Not necessarily, right, what works for the individual. And so when we have individual weirdos and individual sick or evil people, we absolutely can be morally condemnatory toward them. Well, maybe not absolutely morally condemnatory, but we can be very strongly morally condemnatory from the perspective of saying that their approach to achieving their individual desires does not work for society. It undercuts society, it causes society's fabric to break down, people don't trust each other, they don't interact with each other, and so forth, right? So that way of operating in the world is socially destructive, and so from the perspective of what works for society, we can lodge moral objections against those individuals who are usually in the small minority against whatever it is that they're doing. So if we add this then qualifier all the way through this derivation here, we then say what works is what satisfy social, right, desires, right, or social goals, right, or social needs. And we would add the social here. Desires then are socially, right, subjective. Right? What counts as a legitimate desire is something that evolves in the course of social evolution and, right, and social discussion, right, and debate and so forth. Truth then is something that is not individualistically subjective but rather socially subjective. And of course subjects, societies and so forth are variable, and so we would then say truth is socially variable. Right? What is going to work for this culture or this society at this time is not necessarily what's going to work for that culture at that time, and so just across cultures then we need to be a lot more tolerant and less dogmatic, right, and so forth. Okay, so problem solved on the assumption that the problem we're trying to solve is the individual weirdos, right, and sickos. This is the approach that John Dewey in the second generation especially emphasizes, and so for him the socialization, right, of values becomes absolutely important. And also this concept here of democracy, which I've had in the scare quotes for quite a while, becomes a very important concept in the pragmatic lexicon, so to speak. But again, if we apply it to this framework here, we see that democracy is now being used a whole lot more broadly rather. Democracy is not for the pragmatists, particularly the pragmatists of the John Dewey, right, approach, which is the dominant approach. It's not simply a matter of a divisive majority rule on politics. Whoever gets the most votes in this particular election cycle has political power for the next X years, and then we go through the process again and reassign political power. Rather, democracy, that is to say, this process of social debate, social discussion, social trying to achieve consensus, social voting, sometimes explicitly, sometimes tacitly, is much deeper than simply politics. It is the democratic process through which we decide what is moral. It's also an epistemological concept. It is the democratic process through which we decide what is true, right? What's true for our society, what is moral for our society, what is going to be our political structure, right, for the next period of time, right, in our society. So what we have then is a deep, right, democracy. Democracy is a deep philosophical concept covering all of the branches, right, of philosophy, not simply the political applications in this case. All right, problem solved, but not entirely, because there's then an additional problem. We'll call this problem 2. The pragmatists will solve the problem of individual weirdos by socializing things, but we'll call this problem sub 2. The idealists and the realists will just come back and say, this really just kicks things upstairs, because what then do we say about not individual weirdos, but societies that are outright weird, right, or sick, right? We do know there are lots of societies that have long-standing cultural practices that most of the people in that society don't have any particular problem with. Selling daughters into prostitution is still a practice in some parts of the world. Some parts of the world have no problem with racism, right, with genocide if you're a part of the wrong ethnic group. Treating women as second, third, or fourth class citizens. What do we say? And then we get out the historical heavy artillery. What do we say about slavery? Do we just say that slavery was morally unobjectionable because in that society's time and according to their cultural practices, what they had evolved was slavery, and no one objected to it, and so we can't impose our society standards on them? What do we say about Hitler and the Nazis and the Holocaust and various other kinds of genocides that have occurred historically and so on? The objection is going to be that the same problem at the individual level is just kicked upstairs to the social level, and we haven't really solved it. And this is where, in effect, the cutting edge of the debate between the pragmatists, the realists, and the idealists carries on. What do we say about other societies with dramatically different moral frameworks? Is it possible for us to find some objective framework that should apply across all societies? Or is it the case, as the pragmatists say, that we are stuck in a socially bound intellectual and moral framework, and we can't get outside of that to apply our standards across cultures? Okay, we'll pause there. All right, in this next subunit, I want to turn to John Dewey specifically and read you a few excerpts from his major work on education, one of his most influential over the course of the 20th century, called Democracy and Education. We've talked about the concept of democracy, how for the pragmatist, democracy is a deep concept, not simply a political decision-making concept, but it's also rather the process through which we socially form our values. It's the process through which we socially form our theories and our beliefs about the nature of the world that we're living in. And so in 1916, Dewey publishes Democracy and Education, applying that concept of democracy to education, right? In particular, Dewey was deeply engaged with issues of education and spent a great deal of his career focusing on issues of philosophy of education and putting that philosophical system, the pragmatic philosophical system, into educational practice. So it's worth touching base with several of the key quotations I've selected from that work here. Now, the first one I want to read to you points out the importance of biology and a very naturalistic approach to biology to the pragmatic perspective. As we mentioned before, the pragmatists in the 19th century, in their formative years when the school was being put together, it is a century in which evolutionary ideas are coming to the fore, and biology comes to be seen, if not the mother science, but rather the science that is most illustrative and captures the deepest knowledge about what it is to be a human being in this world here. So the first quotation is just the first sentence here, where Dewey is putting his discussion of education in a biological context here. Quote, "The most notable distinction between living and inanimate beings is that the former maintain themselves by renewal." Right, so we're putting ourselves in the context of the distinction between living beings and non-living beings. So we're interested in the biological here. What do we mean by a living being, right, or a life form? Dewey then in the next paragraph says, life, quote, is a self-renewing process through action upon the environment. Now we'll notice here that Dewey is not talking about knowledge first and foremost. You say life is a process of action, right, upon the environment. So the emphasis is, as a pragmatist, upon action, not first on acquiring knowledge and then acting on the basis of that, but rather action upon the environment, and then that is a self-renewing process. So we have also the emphasis on process, not stasis here. How does this go on? Quote, "In all the higher forms, this process cannot be kept up indefinitely. After a while, they succumb, they die. The creature is not equal to the task of indefinite self-renewal. But continuity of life process is not dependent upon the prolongation of the existence of any one individual." End quote. Pause right for a moment here. If we look at the life process, individuals come and go, Dewey is pointing out, right? That much is obvious. But the evolutionary process, right, of life is not contingent upon any one individual, right? It's going to be more of a species focus. Individuals come and go, but the group, right, the society that makes up that particular species, that is the unit that has preservation across time. Picking up the quotation again, quote, "Reproduction of other forms of life goes on in continuous sequence. And though, as the geological record shows, not merely individuals but also species die out, the life process continues in increasingly complex form. As some species die out, forms better adapted to utilize the obstacles against which they struggled in vain come into being. Continuity of life means the continual readaptation of the environment to the needs of living organisms." All right, so a heavily biological process, a heavily evolutionary take on the life process, one that emphasizes action and process, and we're starting to scale away from a focus on individuals to species and the evolution of species here. What does this then mean for education? Well, 2 paragraphs down, Dewey then makes an explicit connection to education and defines it for us. Quote, "Education, in its broadest sense, is the means of this social continuity of life." Unquote. Education is about the social continuity, right, of life. It's not primarily focused on the individual. Picking up the quotation again. Quote, "Every one of the constituent elements of a social group, in a modern city as in a savage tribe, is born immature, helpless, without language, beliefs, ideas, or social standards. Each individual, each unit who is the carrier of the life experience of the group, in time passes away, yet the life of the group goes on." Now notice how Dewey's focus is on the group, right, and the continuity of the group right across time here, but he defines the individual in terms of the group. What you are as an individual is, quote, "the carrier of the life experience of the group." Right? You are a vehicle, right, through which the group lives. It's not primarily that you're an individual, right, with your own life, right, and so forth. You are part of a group. It is through you and all kinds of other individuals, more or less just like you, that the group carries on, right, across time here. And then carrying on in the next paragraph here, the purpose of education then is, quote, "They must be initiated into the interests, purposes, information, used, skills, and practices of the mature members. Otherwise, the group will cease its characteristic life." Right? We're concerned with the life of the group, and the reason why we're educating individuals is so that the group, right, can carry on, right, across time. All right, what does it then mean to have a group? Right? What is it to be a group, and what is it to have a functioning group, and what should the individual's beliefs and actions be so that he or she is contributing appropriately in the group context here? All right, quotation, this is now skipping over a little bit here. Very strong quotation though, but what it is to be an individual properly in a social group. Quote, "Individuals do not compose a social group because they all work for a common end." Okay, I'm going to pause there. There are common ends. Suppose we have a number of individuals and they are all working toward that common end. It's not the case that every individual has his or her own ambitions, goals, pursuit of happiness. Rather, suppose we have a group in which individuals do have a common end and they're all working for that common end. Dewey is suggesting that's not enough yet to have a group in the proper sense here. Repeating that quote, "Individuals do not even compose a social group because they all work for a common end." And then carrying on the quote, "The parts of a machine work with a maximum of cooperativeness for a common result, but they do not form a community. If, however, they were all cognizant of the common end and all interested in it so that they regulated their specific activity in view of it, then they would form a community." So ending the quote there for a moment and pausing. What Dewey is saying here is what we're striving for is not only everybody working for a common end, right? There's one set of common ends, everybody in a society should be working toward that, but that everybody should be consciously aware of that common end toward which they are working. Everybody should be interested in that one common end or that one set of common ends for society, and everybody as individuals should be regulating and directing their actions toward that common end. That's what it is to have a group, right, in Dewey's sense. That's what education is about. That's what we should be striving for. And he ends this paragraph with a fairly strong statement about the nature of group identity. Quote, "Consensus demands communication." Right, so communication here is the process of educating, where one generation communicates its beliefs, its ways of doing things to the next generation, who are then going to pick up the gauntlet, so to speak. But The standard that we're setting is very high here. It's not even a majoritarian standard. It is, in Dewey's language here, consensus. And consensus is everybody on the same page, everybody with the same beliefs, everybody regulating their actions with the same set of interests toward the same common communal goals. All right, that is why I am emphasizing this fact that while the pragmatists are broadly speaking naturalists, that's their orientation, as is the case with realists, that while the pragmatists are very science-friendly, as the realists tend to be very science-friendly, nonetheless, this value framework, the realists being much more individualistic, the pragmatists being much more social, community, even communalistically oriented, as we see in the Dewey passages here, that is a very deep divide. And that leads to many significant differences in educational practice, and that's what we will turn to in the next subunit. All right, we next want to turn to pragmatism's implications for educational practice, and there are many significant ways in which educational practice changes to the extent that one takes pragmatic philosophy to be the guiding set of principles. What I want to do is take up 4 sets of issues, the curriculum in general, then secondarily focusing on 3 particular elements of the curriculum and show how pragmatic philosophy leads to a distinctive approach there. Then talk about the student participation in these processes, emphasizing group dynamics rather than individuality. And then finally, the role of the teacher as well. And in all 4 of these points, I've singled them out because the way pragmatism approaches these issues is in marked contrast to the other 2 philosophies we've looked at, idealism and realism, so it gives us a good opportunity for comparison and contrast. All right, first, the curriculum in general. What is distinctive about pragmatism is that it is much more focused on applied issues in education and tends to de-emphasize theoretical and abstract approaches to education. And then secondarily, that it is one of the leading philosophies pushing for an interdisciplinary approach to education as opposed to a more traditional carving up of the curriculum into discrete subject matters that may or may not be connected to each other. First, on the issue of applications and the emphasis on the applied. This, of course, comes out of pragmatism's general thrust, where its emphasis on that which works, that which is functional, and so forth. And so the argument here is that when we are constructing our educational mission statement and putting that into practice, we should be emphasizing practicality, the hands-on approach to education rather than a book-centered approach to education. It should be an education that is practical and prepares student for life rather than an education that is theoretical and may or may not have any connections to practical life as a student gets older. And then finally, pragmatists will emphasize that education should be hands-on oriented and less book-centered than traditionally done so, much more emphasizing the applied, less emphasis on the theoretical, and even that might be putting it too weakly. In many cases, pragmatists will like to say that education is not preparation for life, but rather education is a part of life. So we break down the distinction between, or rather the traditional distinction between schools as a distant, artificial reality, and then we talk about what happens when we get out into the real world. Pragmatism wants to argue that the student should always be in the real world, and we see education as part and parcel of a life fully lived. So we never make those severances that many educational systems will make. Another way to put it philosophically and a little bit more broadly is in contrast to the other philosophies that we've looked at so far, idealism and realism. One of the things that is characteristic we've seen of idealism as a philosophical system is its duality, that it is not particularly interested in what it takes to be a lower material, or physical world, that its emphasis is on a higher abstract or spiritual world. And so it will then, as an implication when talking about education, talk about knowledge for its own sake, or pure theory, and admire that at the expense of what it will take to be grubby practicality. So one thing then we can cartoonily do with idealism is say that idealism is all theory and very little by way of connections to practicality. When we turn to realism, one of the things that the realists stressed in their differences with the idealists was the necessity for integrating theory with practice. And we can then see the pragmatists as one further evolution on that step. They round out the trilogy, so to speak, by emphasizing the practical, emphasizing the hands-on, and typically having less interest in the theoretical and almost no interest in knowledge for its own sake, as it is sometimes said. So I have on the board here a little graphic that might be helpful here. There's ongoing debate about the nature of the relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge. The idealists emphasize theoretical knowledge at the expense of the practical. The pragmatists emphasize practical knowledge at the expense of the theoretical. And the realists are the ones who want to integrate the two harmoniously, hopefully. All right, that is the curriculum in general. I now want to turn to a few remarks about students and how students participate in the educational process. The pragmatists, like the realists, put the students front and center and see them as the primary agents in the learning process. And this is in contrast for both of them to the idealists. The idealists tend to make the teacher more central. The teacher is the person who has the expertise and the character, and he or she delivers or imparts things to students who may or may not be interested. What we find as we go from idealism to realism, the student takes a more central role and the teacher takes a more de-emphasized role. And certainly by the time we get to the pragmatists, the students are really front and center, and the role of the teacher is more relegated to being that of a facilitator. But more on the teacher side of the things of the line in a few minutes. I want to focus now on the students. Also in keeping here with the pragmatic philosophy is the fact that the pragmatic philosophy emphasizes groups, emphasizes the social over the individuality, and that then means for educational practice that education should be seen primarily as a social enterprise, not something that is an individual student mastering individualized knowledge, using his or her own mind to work on problems and decide what direction he or she wants to take things. Pragmatists, rather, are much more social, much more communal, much more democratic in their approach to education, and that then means that much or most of education should be done in a group context and should be done in group work. Now, this is then not to say that they won't ever have students doing individual work, just as with the realists being much more individualistic. It's not to say that the realists won't ever have students doing group work, but the emphasis is dramatically different. Whereas for the realists, most of education is a matter of individual minds coming to know what they need to know in order to flourish in life. The pragmatists are more likely to argue that most of what we do in life is social, and so therefore education being an exemplar of real life, it should mostly be group work. So if we are doing reading projects, then we will do reading circles, right, for example. If we are doing chemistry labs, we will have partners on which we are working on the chemistry labs. If we are doing theater is again something that's going to be emphasized by the pragmatists just because it's more easily lending itself to group projects. If we're doing physical education, we're less likely to do individualized sports as the realists are. As pragmatists, we're more likely to make sure that all of the physical education involves group sports or team sports or at least group activities, right, and so forth. Putting these group projects into practice then means that when teachers are preparing students for doing their work or strategizing how the students are going to do their work ahead of time, the teacher needs to lay the groundwork and be attentive to all the ways in which group work can be successful, but also ways in which it can be dysfunctional. If we take the theme of democracy as a guiding value theme for pragmatism, what the teacher is going to want to do is ensure that and help students work on their group projects in a way that trains them and models democratic decision making. So he or she may initially divide students into various sorts of groups and then help them work through deciding who's going to do what parts of the division of labor, how it's going to be coordinated, if there are differences of opinion, how those are going to be sorted out, helping them with the discussions, then pointing out at a certain point it'll be time to bring the discussions to a close and put things to a vote, right, as a group. And then as the students get more comfortable with all of these processes, then the students then can automate that process and start to do it increasingly for themselves. What this also means is that the teacher is, on the dysfunctionality side of the equation, going to have to pay attention proactively from his or her own experience to all of the ways in which we know that groups can go wrong or be less functional than ordinarily we would want them to be. For example, does the teacher always decide? You four, say, are forming one group, you four are forming another group, or you six, or you three, or whatever the numbers would be. The teacher doesn't want to do that too much because we want the students to start forming their own groups and being the active participants in this process. But we do know that as students start to do that, there are some things that start to happen. Students only want to work in groups with their friends, right? Or the boys only want to work with boys and the girls only want to work with girls. Or some students are more popular and other students are less popular, and so everybody wants to have the popular kids in their groups and nobody wants to have the unpopular kids in those groups. Now the teacher then ahead of time has to be aware that these kinds of things are going to arise and be ready to intervene or ready to tweak or massage things in such a way so that those things don't become commonplace, or at least don't become rigidified within the school year, say, for example. We also know as teachers, probably from our own experience as students, that when we are working in groups, there are intra-group dynamics that can occur. There are, in many cases, kids who are grasping the material more quickly than other kids, and that can then lead to, say, on the part of the kids who are grasping the material more quickly, a certain amount of impatience. That can then lead them to say, for example, well, I'm not going to participate in the group project, I'm just going to do it all myself, and then when we have to hand in our group project, really it just amounts to being the work of one or two students, and they kind of feel that they've been taken advantage of because they're have done rather all of the work, but other students are getting the credit for it. And that also can encourage on this part of the students who didn't do a whole lot of work a kind of parasitic emphasis or encourage them to, since they didn't have to do any work in this particular case, but nonetheless they got the credit for the group work as well. So we do know that as teachers that kind of dynamic is going to happen. How do we monitor the situation as it's evolving to make sure that it isn't happening? We also know that some students are likely to be bullies and other students are likely to be more passive. We know that some students are going to have social skills that don't lend to their working with other people civilly, right, and diplomatically. Some students have a difficult time with compromise and so on. So what we then need to do as teachers is, based on our own past experience in experimenting with, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, group works, really sit down scientifically and make a list of all of the ways in which group dynamics can go wrong and be ready to intervene, hopefully not too authoritarianly, when these things arise in the student groups that we are having the students work in. Now, all of this can be very delicate for teachers, particularly teachers who've been schooled in traditional education, where what we learn as students is, in most cases, that the teacher is the authority figure, that her word is law, and we should do what the teacher says. Under pragmatism, with its emphasis on democracy and the themes of equality, how the teacher interacts with students should be dramatically changed. And one of the things that the pragmatists insist upon is that the teacher should not elevate herself to a position of authority, certainly not an authoritarian, right, kind of authority. Instead, he or she should be a facilitator as much as possible, and having the students do their own hands-on project and internalizing the working. Nonetheless, there does need to be a role for a teacher here, and how the teacher facilitates is in many cases a delicate matter here. Let me give you one example that I remember having a debate over at a conference, and in the group of students, group of teachers and other education professionals who were at this conference. There's a fairly quick split over how to handle the situation, as I put it forth, between those who were strongly committed to a pragmatic approach and those who were either realists or idealists. Or there were some other participants as well. But here was the scenario as I put it forward. Suppose, say, we have a group of students, and let's have them be middle schoolers. That is to say, they are around 12 years old or so. And you're working on a group in a group project, and there are 4 of them. And we have an interdisciplinary project that they're working on, and it's nonetheless a project that, say, they'll be working on over the course of a month or so. It's a relatively long-term project with many stages. And they're partway through the process, and they've reached a stage in the project where they have to do some mathematics. They've gotten some results, but they have to do some mathematical calculations, and then depending on what those results are, they will then go in this way with the rest of the project, or take this alternative route with the rest of the project. So the students are working away on this, and you as the teacher notice that one of the groups seems to be getting into a somewhat heated argument. So you drift on over as the teacher to get a sense for what's going on there and see whether an intervention is necessary or not. And it turns out that in this group of 4 students, they're having an argument over the right way to do some mathematical calculations in this project here. And 3 of the students are quite insistent that the right way to solve the mathematical problem, say, is this particular way, and that there was this particular answer is the right answer to the mathematical problem. And there's one student who is quite insistent, rather, that that's not the right way to do the mathematics. This is the right way to do the mathematics, and the correct answer that the group should achieve is this other answer over here. You, from your teacherly perspective, knowing the math quite well, know that the 3 who are in the majority have made a mistake. They've made a mistake in the calculation, a methodological error, and so correspondingly the result that they've reached is incorrect. And in this case, the one student has done the mathematics correctly, and the answer that he has reached is in fact the correct answer here. Now then the question is, having assessed the situation at this point, what should the teacher do? And the point of the example, of course, is to say, do we take the more traditional model, which is to say, we believe there are such things as right answers, there are such things as correct methods to use in achieving right answers, particularly in mathematics. The job of the teacher is to teach those proper methodologies to the students. And so if the students are making a mistake, it's the teacher's job then to correct the students and guide them in the direction of proper methodology and the proper answers, in which case, in this particular instance, the teacher would step in, correct the 3 students who have made an error, and side with the single student who has done things correctly. If, however, we take the pragmatic themes, we're more likely to be resistant to that approach, because that is much too top-down, that's much too absolutist, that's much too teacher inserting herself as the authoritarian figure who comes along to save the day, and that's not the right kind of modeling that we want to do socially in education. So what we're more likely then to say is, as the teacher, we might say, if the debate has been getting a little bit heated there, the teacher will insert herself into it in a facilitating diplomatic role. She might say, all right, you single student over here, why don't you try explaining again your mathematical procedures and see if you can convince the 3. And then she might say, all right, you 3, what do you think of that? Why don't you guys try again explaining your way of doing the mathematics to this individual student who is currently dissenting. And you would then hope that through that process of dialogue and discussion, they then might reach a consensus, right, one way or the other. The single student might convince the three, and the three might convince the one. Then you reach a democratic consensus, and the group can then, move forward. But here's then going to be the follow-up problem. What happens if you do that diplomatic exercise, this student sticks to his guns, these three students over here also stick to their guns, and the process reaches a gridlock? A principled pragmatic approach would then say we cannot override the democratic process here. We don't want authoritarianism to dominate the classroom. And so what the teacher would properly do is say, all right, we have gone through the process. What happens in a democratic process is eventually we call the question, we reach closure on the debate, we put things to a vote. In this particular case, what would happen then, of course, is the three students would outvote the single student. That group then, as a group, would reach an answer, and it would go on to the next stage of the process. Now, hopefully, right, in the back of your teacher's mind as a pragmatist, you would say, or you would be hoping rather to yourself, that the group would then try to apply that set of answers that they reach from the incorrect mathematical calculations. They would run into a roadblock at a certain point further down, and they would then backtrack to this point and say, all right, well, maybe what we should do is try the other students, the single students' way of doing things to see if that works better. But there's no guarantee that that's going to happen, and certainly the teacher can't pull the strings, right, to make sure that that sort of thing happens. Now, the point of this exercise is that at the conference with other educational professionals, when we were talking through this example, you could tell very quickly who among the educational professionals and teachers were leaning more toward the pragmatic model and who was leaning more toward traditional idealism and the realist approach. The realists and the idealists were quite insistent that what's more important here is that the students get the right answer and that they therefore be corrected, and it's appropriate for the teacher as an authority figure to do so. The pragmatic educators were very resistant to that approach and thought quite insistently that the democratic process had to take its course for good or ill in this particular case. There's also a point about character education that drives home some differences between the realists, for example, on this issue, and the pragmatists in this particular example. What do you say if you're a pragmatic teacher to the individual student who is sitting there saying, I know I got the mathematics right, and I just couldn't convince those three, but I got outvoted? What do you say by way of consolation to that single student? Well, as a pragmatic teacher, what you're likely then to do is to say, well, what's more important here is the democratic procedure. And in many cases, what happens is the individual gets outvoted, and what you just have to do is compromise and go along with the group, even if you don't think that the group is correct here. So what you will do is encourage the student to put the needs or the desires of the group above his own judgment and to be willing to compromise, right, for the sake of the group. That's what your moral theory, right, as a pragmatist will indicate a proper character approach to this group dynamic, right, is going to be. You might point out to the student that that's the way much of life is going to be, right? If you look at the business world, you go into a manager's meeting, there can be lots of ideas floated around, then the managers all vote. Lots of times you're going to be in the minority, and you're quite convinced that the majority opinion is a ridiculous opinion or it's not going to work, but what you have to do is compromise, suck it up, go along with the majority in that particular business. Or we expand things to the political realm. In a democratic political society, you know that probably half of the time you're going to be in the minority and your candidate is not going to win. Instead, that bozo candidate on the other side of the divide is going to be elected to power. You can't sulk. Instead, what you do is you go along with the majority opinion for the good of the country as a whole. whole. So you have to compromise, you have to put the good of the group above your own personal preferences and opinions in those particular cases. And that's a very different, right, approach to the social morality that we're going to get to the extent that we emphasize pragmatism. Now, by contrast, if we go back to the initial situation of the scenarios I've posed, a realist, as an individualist, is going to approach dealing with that individual student who is in the minority very differently. The realist is more likely to praise the student for independence of judgment, saying it's good that you thought for yourself, you stuck to your guns, you, when you knew you were right, you perhaps listened to what they were saying, but you didn't let the fact that there was a whole bunch of them outnumbering you outweigh your independent judgment. So good job in being independent, right, in your thinking here. You as a realist teacher might praise the individual student's courage, right, because the individual student is just one and he's got 3 other group members who are impatient with him, putting all kinds of social pressure on him to change his minds. And we know that there's a certain kind of cowardliness that it's easy for people to slip into when there are certain kinds of social pressure. So we might, as a realist teacher, praise the student for courage and not compromising in this particular situation. So are we likely then to prize students and encourage them to be independent and courageous as individuals, or are we as teachers going to encourage compromise and diplomacy for the sake of the majority interest as the right kind of character approach? Pragmatism and realism really are at loggerheads on those character issues here. All right, next I want to turn to the curriculum in particular and just mention 3 distinctive attributes of a pragmatic curriculum and contrast them especially to idealism and realism again. One thing that the pragmatists are very insistent upon is that the curriculum should not be the traditional piecemeal, siloed curriculum that most of us are familiar with. The pragmatists were among the first to emphasize the interdisciplinary nature of most of the curricular elements, and so to take what had been discrete subjects and start to put them in larger modules and curricular groupings with new labels and so forth. So rather than, for example, teaching history and geography and civics and economics as distinct subject matters, the pragmatists were the first to say we need to put these all into the social sciences, and what we will do is we'll teach social studies, and social studies will be an integrated unit of all of those elements connected. Rather than teaching the sciences in parceled out fashion where we have physics over here and then chemistry and then biology and then mathematics as a separate subject, instead we will just have a science studies unit in which we study all of them in a relatively integrated fashion. And then the same thing holds for the arts and the humanities. So interdisciplinary studies emphasizing the connectedness and the holistic nature of all of knowledge rather than discrete, particularized, atomized, or individualized approaches to the curriculum. The second curricular element I want to focus on is history. History has a special place in the pragmatic curriculum, and the rationale for including history and how history is taught under pragmatism is very different from that of idealism and realism. Just backtrack a little bit to pragmatism's philosophical themes. If we think of the metaphysics of pragmatism, pragmatism emphasizes evolution as a fundamental, not simply biological truth, but metaphysical truth. All of the universe is in process. If we do just focus on the biology for a moment, we know that back a long time ago, the kinds of creatures that existed and flourished on the earth are very different than the kinds of creatures that exist on the earth now. And as evolution progresses, the kind of creatures that exist and flourish on the earth in millions of years from now are again likely to be very different. If we blow that up to cosmic proportions, everything over the course of history is changing, including all of human history. Now this has an implication for the study of history if we think that the past is dramatically different from the present, and that the present is dramatically different than what the future is going to be, then what is the point of studying old things or ancient history, particularly if, as pragmatists, we're interested in practicality, the real world, functionality and workability in the here and now? To the extent that as pragmatists we emphasize process and change, we're more likely then to believe that the way things are now are very different than the way things were in the past, and so things in the distant past have very little relevance to our being able to deal with contemporary issues. So for metaphysical reasons, pragmatists are more likely then to de-emphasize ancient history, right, or classical history, and the kinds of history that they will be interested in are going to be relatively recent historical events, because the world hasn't changed as much in recent times, and so there might still be some lessons for us to learn, practical lessons from relatively recent history. If we move now on to epistemological issues from the pragmatic perspective, a strong theme within pragmatism is a healthy dose of skepticism. That is to say, a belief that human knowledge is fallible, that human knowledge is in many cases biased, that human knowledge is at best partial. And what this then implies for the study of history is that the more distant we are from the actual events back in the olden days, the more partial our knowledge is going to be, the more our biases from our contemporary perspective are going to limit us from being able to get inside the framework of an ancient time. And so as a result, historical knowledge is going to be seen as increasingly suspect. That is to say, pragmatists are less likely to think that we can achieve absolute knowledge or certain knowledge or even reliable knowledge about things the further back in history that they go. So historical knowledge or historical claims or historical narratives then from the pragmatic perspective tend to be treated much more skeptically than are treated by, say, the idealists and the realists, all of whom are more optimistic about our ability to acquire knowledge. Now, what this then implies rather for the study of history is that if we don't think historical knowledge is reliable, then we're not as likely to include it in our curriculum. We only want to have things that are reliable. If historical knowledge is suspect, then it becomes de-emphasized. Another thing that is characteristic of pragmatism, of course, is its value orientation. They will emphasize, this is partly an epistemological point, partly a value point, that we use knowledge for practical purposes. We're not as interested in truth for its own sake. But if it's also the case that human beings are biased and subjective, what is typically then going to be the case is that what we call historical knowledge is going to be something that comes down to us as constructed by people for their own sake, with their particular interests, with their particular biases, and so forth. And if our interests and our own biases in the modern world are different, then we're less likely to find the ancient history useful to us. It's often said, and pragmatists especially like this saying, that history is written by the winners. And so 300 years ago or 2,000 years ago, the people who were writing the history books or the history scrolls were likely to have been the winners, the victors, the ones who are more powerful. And so, of course, then we're just going to get a very biased and selective history. And so that is what gets handed down to us. That was history written with a particular set of axes to grind. We're dealing with very different axes right now. Chances are very good that what we're getting is not reliable and it's not going to suit our purposes now. So history becomes less valuable from the pragmatic perspective. Now, there's an interesting anecdote I'd like to share with you at this point, and it's another anecdote that differentiates the pragmatic approach to history from that of the realists and the idealists. Suppose we play up two pragmatic themes, right? One theme being that There is no such thing really as absolute truth, and particularly no reliably certain historical truth. And we play up the theme that what we're interested in education is that which works, that which gets the job done, that which succeeds at getting us to wherever we need to go in education. And then we consider, say, we're teaching an American history class, the story about George Washington and his having cut down the cherry tree. And his father then calls him into his study and says, George, I noticed that cherry tree got cut down. Do you know anything about this? And reputably, George Washington says, I cannot tell a lie, Father. I cut down the cherry tree. I suppose as a history teacher, a teacher of American history, you love this story. You've been using it for years. It's an example of George Washington's integrity, his honesty, and you want to play it up partly as a lesson in character, that if you're going to be the kind of person who socializes well and can become a right kind of leader, then you have to be more like George Washington. And so you fold that into your historical lessons. But suppose you're continuing to do some reading in American history, keeping up with the field, and you note that some American historians are having this debate over whether that anecdote about George Washington really is true. Is it true that George Washington really did cut down the cherry tree and confessed when asked by his father, or is this story something that later biographers and hagiographers kind of constructed and grafted onto George Washington's biography, and so it's not really true? Okay, and so there's this ongoing debate then, say, within the field of American historical scholarship. You're, say, a high school teacher, and you've used the George Washington anecdote for many years, and you then run into this debate within the historical field. Next time you're going to be teaching American history, what then do you do? Well, we'll develop one line of reasoning here. It's going to be the line of reasoning that will drive realists and idealists crazy. What if we said, look, nobody really knows the truth here. It's ancient history. History is written by the winners. So whether the anecdote really is true or whether the anecdote is a later made-up story, nobody really knows. So the important thing, though, is for me as a history teacher to get the students to believe that having honesty and integrity is important, and to teach certain social lessons. And I have here an anecdote about George Washington that has worked beautifully over the course of my teaching career to get students to take this seriously. George Washington then is a hero in their minds, right, as a result of this story. If I don't think truth fundamentally matters or that truth is fundamentally accessible, I'm only interested in what works, then I am more likely as a history teacher then to say, well, I can in good conscience just carry on using the George Washington anecdote in future generations of students. Now, if we are realists or idealists, what we're more likely then to say is, and this would be very different, to say, no, truth matters here. And what's important to my character as a teacher is only to teach things that I know to be true. So I need to do further investigation here, read up on this debate among the historians. If it turns out that that anecdote was made up and is not truthful to George Washington's biography, then I should stop using that anecdote and find some other truthful anecdote that will make the same points that I want about moral education. On the other hand, if I read further into the story and it turns out that the historians haven't quite worked it out, then when I'm teaching the story, I should probably add a disclaimer of a sort. Say, now, historians aren't sure, students, whether this is really true or not, but it's an interesting story, and then with those qualifiers, go ahead and relate the anecdote. So, do we take historical truth seriously and believe in it, or are we primarily interested in what works, and historical truth is an abstraction that may or may not be realizable? One more small point about the pragmatic teaching of history, particularly in contrast to the idealists and the realists. The pragmatists are very interested in what works in the real world as it is. For metaphysical reasons and epistemological reasons, they do not think that the historical is, particularly the ancient historical, is of practical relevance to the contemporary, especially given how much the world has changed and evolved, and also for skeptical reasons that historical knowledge is even more difficult to get than knowledge of the contemporary, and so it's much less likely to be accurate and reliable. What this means then is that the historical curriculum for pragmatists is much more likely to be very contemporary, and there's going to be very little interest in teaching classical history or ancient history. For both of those reasons. Now this is in direct contrast to the idealists who are at the other end of the spectrum. For the idealists, what is old, what is ancient, what is classical is more likely to be the central part of the historical curriculum. And the idealists are going to more likely de-emphasize any relevance of contemporary concerns or the present day. From the idealist perspective, it is the timeless, it is the eternal, it is that which has stood the test of time that we are most likely to find the important lessons of life in. And from the idealist perspective, it is then the great civilizations and the great thinkers of the past who are more likely to have latched onto the important truths. It's going to be the classic authors, those who have withstood rather the assault of history, who have stood the test of time. Those are the ones who we're likely to read, and so we should be reading the classic books, the old books. The contemporary is more likely to be ephemeral, it's more likely to be particularized, it's more likely to be concrete bound to our particular time. So there is a very great collision in the teaching of history between the pragmatists and the idealists on just this score. The idealists are very classically oriented, not very interested in the contemporary, and by contrast, the pragmatists are very interested in the contemporary and not particularly interested in the practical. And again, in keeping with the theme of integration that is characteristic of realism, realists are more likely to emphasize both. That there are some things that stay the same across time, but also we're interested in the particular uniqueness, right, of past times as well as present times. And so the realists are more likely to argue that we should teach classical history and recent history, but we should also try to integrate the two as much as we possibly can. All right, I now want to turn finally to one more curricular element that's important to the pragmatists, but also serves to differentiate pragmatism from the other two isms, idealism and realism, and that is the teaching of art. Like the realists, pragmatists are favorable toward art and think that art should have a significant place in the curriculum. And so the pragmatists and the realists are both then in distinction to the idealists who are more likely to be suspicious of art and to censor it or not include it in the curriculum. But even here, the pragmatists' approach to art is very different given their philosophical themes. One point of difference is that with their emphasis on the social, the primary emphasis on the social that we get in pragmatism, the kind of arts that the pragmatists are interested are going to be arts that emphasize the social. So for example, if we are doing exercises, say, that involve painting, right, or drawing and so on, the pragmatist is not going to, as a realist is likely to do, to say, here I've got 20 students, each student gets his or her own sketch pad or his or her own easel and works on his or her own art project. Rather, if we are interested in painting, we would want to have our students work on a joint project. Say we would work on a mural, and all of the students would jointly work on the mural. Some of the students would be doing the sketching, some of the students would be painting the green of the forest, right, or whatever it would be. But then the idea is all the students are working together to figure out the design, the execution, and the end result is a group project. So that's one emphasis, emphasis on social things in the arts, mural projects, theatrical projects, again, would be important, right, and so on. Less emphasis on individual projects. Another distinctive pragmatic emphasis is with the emphasis on the utilitarian, emphasis on that which works, emphasis with that which is functional. The pragmatists are not interested in art for its own sake, right? Or the idea that there is this aesthetic realm that is distinct from the rest of life and that artists are off in their own little universe while the rest of us are engaged with the practical day-to-day type of living. So the kind of art that the pragmatists are more likely to prize is going to be art that folds the aesthetic elements or the design elements into something functional, into something utilitarian. So if we say, for example, take furniture, of course it's possible just to create a pretty ordinary boring table or a boring chair or a boring cabinet, and that's fine. We do need to have those functional utilitarian objects in our houses and in our lives. What the pragmatists are more likely then to say is that the aesthetic should be folded into. So we start with utilitarian, functional, practical objects, but then we might consider wood grains, how it's going to be painted, what the particular design elements are going to be. But the aesthetic is not a thing in and of its own self. It is folded into and integrated into a functional or utilitarian object. So any sort of art then that tries to detach the aesthetic, and we end up with art that is completely useless, completely functional, completely abstracted from any sort of practical real-life considerations or usefulness. That sort of art, the pragmatists would say, is self-indulgent and completely useless and not really appropriate approaches to art. So, art that is social, art that is functional is going to be emphasized here. Another way to put this is to say, if we consider, for example, 20th century art, there are art movements in 20th century art that the pragmatists are more likely to be sympathetic toward. If we think, for example, of the social realist movement of the 1930s, if we think of various kinds of folk art, art that arises out of communities and involves festivals and celebrations that are organic outgrowth of their cultural practices, or the social realist art that I mentioned, that is art directed toward actual social concerns that are going on politically, economically, and more broadly socially. That sort of art movement, the pragmatists will say, is useful. What the pragmatists are less likely to be interested in is something like, say, abstract expressionism, where this is not too much of an exaggeration, where we have individuals who are saying, I am a misunderstood genius, here I am in my New York City loft, and when the individual spirit moves me, I'll do these paint spatters on canvas and then put last night's leftover dinner on the canvas and then bake it in the oven and call that my artwork. And then I'll put it on display, and most people aren't going to understand it, but that just shows how the vast majority of society doesn't understand me, the lonely, elite individual artist. Okay, so I'm exaggerating here, but the point is, if I am an artist and I'm saying, here I'm the individual who is in the elite and I am above the ordinary run of mankind, that's much too elitist, much too aristocratic, much too individualistic, right, from the pragmatic perspective. What the pragmatists are interested in, artists who are integrated into their communities, who see themselves as one organic element right within that community, part of society, not in an adversarial relationship to that sort of society. So a movement, I think, like abstract expressionism would be very suspect from the pragmatist perspective. So we want arts that are functional, we want arts that are social, and we also want arts that are more democratic and egalitarian and less individualistic and aristocratic.